Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the PECB webinar. Today, we're going to be covering a couple of topics. I'm not sure if the PECB folks want to do a quick intro or if you want us to just go ahead and get rolling. All right, I'll take that as get rolling. So today we're going to be talking about a couple of different frameworks and sort of how they relate. But before we do that, I want to introduce the panelists. Myself, Sawyer Miller, I work at Risk 360. I'm a senior manager here, and I oversee our ISO practice line. Eric?
Hi, I'm Eric Tomasi. I'm a former CIO and CISO for InfoSec over 25 years, ISO 27001 certified, and look forward to the talk.
Yeah, and I'm Danny Manimbo. I'm a principal here at Schellman and Company. I'm based in Denver, Colorado. Been with the firm 9 years, and part of my role here is overseeing our attestation services as well as co-directing our ISO certification services practice.
All right. So our agenda today is covering, again, 3 standards. We're going to talk about 27032, which is really a framework for cybersecurity risks. I'll be covering that topic. Eric's going to be going over the 27001 and 2 standards, how those relate, sort of things you need to know about those. And then Danny's going to be covering some really important updates to 27002, which you all may or may not know about, and expected updates to 27001. And then we'll leave a little bit of time towards the end for Q&A. So, great. All right, so we'll jump into the first slide here. 27032, as I mentioned, it's a framework for cybersecurity risks. It's really, it's an older standard, right? It's 10 years old. However, if you really take the time and read through the standard, the concepts in there still apply. So if you want to hit that first bullet point, Eric. So first and foremost, cybersecurity focuses on protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of assets, usually data that our stakeholders care about. And so this diagram here on the right is something that I pulled out of that standard. It's really helpful. It really helps us build sort of a conceptual way of thinking about risk. Next bullet point. So as you think about risk assessments and risk management in general, you can sometimes get overwhelmed. It's really hard to think about how do I really conceptualize the things I need to know to be able to execute and identify the risks that my organization cares about and that my stakeholders care about. Next bullet. So what we have to do first is identify assets. So assets, again, most of the time is data, right? When we talk about information security, we're usually talking about information or digital in digital format. But assets can be other things, right? It can be the servers and things processing that data. It can be our laptops that we're using, our desktops that we're using to process that data. Could be people, could be software, could be all kinds of things. So thinking through that exercise of what are my assets is really important. Next is considering threats against them. So if you look towards the bottom left of that, that chart there on the right, you'll kind of see that there's sort of 2 threat bubbles. One is threat agents. Those are the people, if you will, the things that want to leverage threats. And then there's the threats themselves. So once you identify your assets, you can start to think through what are the potential threats against them. And then lastly are the vulnerabilities. So ideally you have some type of a control set already established, or at least one that you've decided you want to pursue implementation of. And you want to identify vulnerabilities within that control set, meaning what weaknesses in my security program could be exploited by the threats to gain some type of access or unauthorized level of view into my assets. Basically, how can my assets be compromised with the combination of vulnerabilities and threats working together. Those are basically what you want to think through in order to create risk statements. So risk statements are really important to craft effectively, because if you simply state a vulnerability or you simply state a risk, you're not going to wind up with really an actionable risk that you can manage. And that brings me to the last point, which is that risks should be managed to an acceptable level. What that implies is you need to define what acceptable is. So think about, for each risk, for each articulated statement that you come up with, what is the acceptable level of risk that you're willing to deal with? And then you need to think of ways to manage that risk down to that acceptable level. And so that's sort of the security concepts and relationships here. Next slide. All right, so who are the stakeholders? We've got several. So executives, right? Executives within our organizations, within partner organizations, customers, they care about what's going on. You can just go through a couple of these, Eric. So boards, our boards of directors, we really want to make sure that, our shareholders, those who are invested in our organizations, are happy with the level of risk that we have. Regulatory bodies, those that may want to, govern how you do things or make sure that you're managing your risks appropriately for whatever regulatory measures you may be subject to. Partners, resellers, channel partners, all the different folks in the market who you may work with. And then lastly is consumers, you and me, right? We are stakeholders. It's a lot of times our data. It may be B2B level data, but it's things that could affect us. It could affect our jobs. And 27032 is interesting because it doesn't only focus on B2B, it focuses on B2C as well. So you think about, all of the social media networks and things that have been in the news and the data that they're sharing and that has come into question. There's a lot of interesting stuff to think about there. And then the last bullet here, there's an interesting quote from 27032 that I thought made a lot of sense. It said, "The cyberspace belongs to no one. Everyone can participate and has a stake in it." So if you're sitting here listening and you're thinking, how does this affect me? It may not be something that you're directly responsible for in your job, but it's something that we should all care about, certainly. All right, next slide. So I want to not only give you some high-level overview of the standard, but I want to give you some examples of these concepts in action. So the first thing I'd advise you doing is take a quick glance at 27032. You can go out to ISO.org, download and buy and download that standard, and filter it for your needs. Again, the standard is very broad, and not everything in it may apply to you. Next is define your roles and responsibilities. A good place to start is think about your departments or your business units. Think about the people in your organization who run the different functions, and sort of chart those out almost as silos of people. The next is get a good GRC tool. So you want to make sure that you have the ability to track the risks that you come up with. So make sure that you can track your risks, your risk owners, and most importantly, treatment plans, because risks are only as good, managing risk is only as good as the treatment plans that you associate to the risks you identify, right? So you want to make sure that you have the ability to track the progress of treatment plans as they're executed. From there, you want to set up interviews with those individuals and stakeholders that you identified in bullet point 2. I advise doing that with individuals or really small groups. The bigger the group, the less content and conversation you can have. And honestly, the less open people are. And you really, really want transparency in these exercises. Next, you want to take them through the exercise of identifying those assets, threats, and vulnerabilities. So maybe even show them that that infographic that we had on slide 1, but talk through what is a threat, what is a vulnerability, what is an asset, help define that and put it in context for them, and then help them understand the information you're looking for to articulate your risk statements. So that's going to be the next bullet point, which is to take all the information you gather, take really good notes, sit down and articulate those risk statements from the information you've gathered. And then lastly, you want to identify risk owners and work with them to develop treatment plans and due dates. Due dates are really important. You need to set realistic expectations of what can be done by when in order to manage risk effectively. And so my last slide here, I want to talk through just a couple of tips. So these are things that I feel like I've learned over the course of doing, a couple hundred of these risk assessments. One is it depends on your organization. Right size your risk assessment approach. If you're 50 people, you're not going to run a risk assessment the same as if you were 1,000 people, right? So think about your organization and the context and the market and the stakeholders, and right size your approach. Next is be clear on scope. So you want to make sure that you are crystal clear on what exactly you're going to be talking about risk for, right? Is it just the company as a whole, or is it a specific set of information? As you'll hear when Eric presents, 27001 really highlights the importance of scope, and so you want to be clear there, and also clear on purpose. You want to define your intended outcomes prior to jumping in. Next is focus on topics and known issues first. So a lot of times we go into these conversations and we know already, probably 50% or more of the risks that exist. Focus on those first, because what you may not know is all of the context around that risk. It can be highly valuable to sit down and get other people's perspective on a known topic or a known risk, because believe it or not, those are the things that tend to be glazed over the most, but they are also the things you could do the most for. Next is ask open-ended questions. One of my favorite questions to ask is, if you could change anything, if you had the full control of the company or the organization, what would you change to reduce information security risk the most? And sometimes you'll get some crazy answers, but what it will help you understand is where their head's at. What are things that keep them up at night? These are going to be really good, useful questions. And then the last point here is, you may not have heard this expression, but don't try to boil the ocean, right? You are not trying to solve every risk in existence for your organization. You want to make sure that you're focusing really on the 20% of risks that are going to have the 80% biggest impact, right? So try to apply that 80-20 rule. And so, yeah, from there, I'll hand it off to Eric.
So, first of all, I never had so much respect for Vanna White and Wheel of Fortune trying to get these get the slides synced. So my talk's gonna be a little more focused on the current 27,000 series. We'll discuss what constitutes the standard and get to some details on 27,001 versus 27,002. So, for some of you familiar with this, I apologize, but we have a broad audience here, so I want to make sure we cover and give some background. So IEC 27,000 series, which is the official name, was a jointly published standard by the international organization, the ISO, which is based in Switzerland, and the International Electrotechnical Commission in 2005. 8 years later, they revised and published the current standard, which is 27,001:2013. So it's an information security management system. That means not only just telling you what controls, it defines how to set up your program. How do you want to manage it? Do you have a CISO? And I think what's happened from that is that's really become the focus of other frameworks where they discuss the entire aspect, whether it's like financial regulation in New York State, NYC Part 500, that they'll have in their framework some controls having a CISO, setting project management. So I think it's kind of, not only is it, universal, but it's also set the precedence for other standards. And as Soyan mentioned, it's a risk-based approach. The first thing you want to do is you want to identify your assets, value them, because the most important thing is if you have something which is worth, say, hypothetically $1,000, and it's going to cost you $1,500 to necessarily secure it, probably doesn't pay. So, you want to make sure you identify your assets, you evaluate them, and then you look, as Soyan mentioned, look at the threats, look at the vulnerabilities associated with that threat, and then use the famous risk matrix, impact versus likelihood. So what is the possibility that this could occur versus what is the likelihood? And then that's how you dictate the criticality, if it's high, and then it helps decide, what should I do about this risk? Should I address it? Should I mitigate it, transfer it? But the risk is paramount in everything related to InfoSec, and in particular, 27,000 series. It's also known as the ISMS family of standards. So if you see sometimes, what's your ISMS like, that's coming from this framework. And some people just prefer to call it for ISO 27K for short. It's considered the gold standard of information security frameworks, and there are countless, as you probably know. And it's the gold standard because it's very comprehensive, it's very rigorous to achieve if you want to get certified, and there's numerous case studies. It was designed to be applicable for small organizations as well as large. You know, I see global multinational firms using it all the time. If you're a domestic organization, there's maybe something which is more applicable and maybe, you know, complementary as opposed to having to pay for the standard. But one common use case I see is like in Silicon Valley. A lot of SaaS vendors, they're asked by various customers, what kind of security you have in place. So rather than dance around and do various questionnaires, they just go for ISO 27001 certification. So it's very popular. So here is a partial list of publications. I mean, 27. There's several dozen, and Sawyer covered one of, you know, the risk management. 27,000 is just the overall ISMS. That's the overview of the framework, the vocabulary. That's just the high-level hierarchy of the standard. You know, and there's several dozen publications. The most famous of which are 27,001 to 27,005. 27,000, I have to say, before I was certified on this, it was confusing to me. So if you're confused, don't feel bad. I don't think it's unique. 27,001 is the standard. When you see that PDF, the document, that is the standard which lays out all the techniques. It tells you, you know, what comprises the standard, both the management clauses, because it's broken up into two parts, as I'll show in the next slide, the management clauses, and then the annexes, which are all the operational controls. And that details everything you need to adhere to meet the standard. 27,002 is an InfoSec code of practice. It's essentially a detailed code catalog of security controls, which tells you what would constitute, you know, security monitoring. Well, you know, it gives you some guidance in how to actually adhere to 27,001. Very useful document if you're not that familiar in terms of how to achieve that. 27,003 is more the project management aspect of it, how to implement it. You know, what is a project plan? You know, what are some recommendations? That's useful if you're on that journey. 27,004 is more about KPIs, because one of the standards for 27,001 is making sure you're constantly improving. So you want to have, once it's established, you want to have some metrics, making sure you're meeting KPIs and you're improving. And then 27,005 is about risk management, and it tells you how to identify, access, evaluate, and then treat various InfoSec risks specific to this framework. But beyond that, if you look online, or you'll see that there's dozens of related publications. One of the most recent ones and famous is the Privacy Information Management System, 27701, and that's really focused on cybersecurity risk related to privacy, which is obviously a hot issue with GDPR and tons of regulations in various countries throughout the world. So here is a high-level overview of 27,001, 2013. So you see the management clauses. So these are all about standing up. Do you have a CISO? You know, do you have planning? Is it included in your project management? Or is it performance evaluation? So this is all about that. The first aspect is all about the management of the program. And you'll see, if you break it out, and it's not that clear, there's about 148 potential control points to consider. And then the second aspect are the clauses. And don't ask me why they start at A5 versus, I think I've heard some reasons why. But from A5 to A18, these are all the operational, your standard typical information security controls. What are you doing for, how's HR security? Asset management, do you have good software and hardware inventory? What do your access controls look like? And you'll see within those, each section, the number of controls which you break out to that. There's two, which I'm going to show in the next slide, information security, and you'll see some of them, as you expect access controls, there's 13 different control points to look at. And so overall, it's 261, and there's different perspectives on this. I mean, that 261 control points to meet, so it's quite rigorous. And here's an example of A5, information security policies, and then here's the objective. This is how it's laid out. Here's the objective, you know, what you need to adhere to. Do you have policies for information security? Here's the control. Do you have that? Are you reviewing them? Typically, you want to review policies on an annual basis. So this is it, and then you'll see the next one just touches on information security. But that's how the framework looks like if you haven't seen it. And then, so the question is, you know, should you use ISO IEC as your framework? And I think there's several questions to consider. And the first one being, how mature is my organization? And while it's true, you can start going for ISO 27001 right off, you know, right off the bat. You know, if you're a relatively immature organization, you don't have much security in place, it might not pay to start with that initially because you're going to be frustrated because you're not going to have a lot of the controls in place. And it's just going not in place, not in place, not in place. Now, if the goal is to get this set up over a period of years and you realize that, then it's okay. But what I often see many of our clients do is they'll focus on maybe doing like a less rigorous standard, such as CIS controls, which is 18 control areas. They'll focus on that. They'll try to improve it, get something stood up in place. And then over the next year or two, then they'll use a crosswork, which is essentially a document which shows how the control in one framework links to another. And here's a sample on the right-hand side. So if you have inventory in place, it shows you the various control points within 27002, which it meets, and as well as how it links to ISO 27001. So that's a good way to get started in terms of, if you want to just show some progress to your management. The second thing is, are we a global organization? As I touched on, in the US, a lot of times people use NIST 853. They're only, they don't have international dealings. I think ISO 27001 is more robust, but they're both, acceptable. And then another factor is consider your industry. Many industries have their own framework, like there'll be healthcare has HIPAA, retail's PCI, energy has FERC. So there's a number of, different things you have to, from a regulatory standpoint, you have to adhere to be compliant within your industry. What we often see is that many clients, they comply with both. They'll do an overall framework. There are mappings as well for these other ones. Like, for example, if you have to do GDPR compliant as well as ISO 27001, roughly about 25 to 30% of the controls overlap. So you can kill two birds with one stone to a certain extent. And then what's the scope of assets we want to protect? I mean, Sawyer touched on this, and I think that's critical because, if you want to do everything, it's going to be extremely costly and difficult. For example, when I was CIO at, Hermes, one of the largest retailers in the luxury retailers, our goal, we knew all the registers, all the gold was on the registers and the point of sale systems. So what we did was we focused the security around that, tightening it up, cordoning it off, and then making sure that that complied with PCI, whereas our other systems may be less rigorous security controls. And then finally, we want to just adhere to the standard, or do we want to become certified? Meeting the standard is often enough for stakeholders. If you say, look, we get some kind of a firm comes in there, they write a letter of attestation, that could be sufficient. If you want to be compliant, it's a minimum of 3-year process. You're gonna have to show extensive evidence for several months for all the controls, and you got to constantly update every year just to make sure you're adhering to them. So it depends what your goal is. Certainly certification is ideal, but it certainly requires a significant investment from the organization in terms of time and resources. So how does 27002 differ from ISO 27001? Because like I said, it can be confusing. So 27001 is essentially, it's the management standard that defines how to build an ISMS. As I talked, there's the management controls, the annex. This is the things you need to have in place to have the program, right? You should use it when you need to, define the scope, the design, and to set up your program. 27002 is going to be the underlying how-to guide. It's a set of guidelines and techniques for how you implement the controls. What should we use for inventory management? What does that look like? What does that constitute? And when you're ready to actually move forward, you should look at 27002 to give you some sense in terms of how to set this up. And just one thing to know, you hear certification. When it comes to certification, the only ISO standard in terms of this you can get certified on is 27001. I'm certified 27001 lead auditor, implementer. You can't get certified on 27002 or 5. It's always 27001. Right? And here's a sample ISO 27002 control pertaining to security monitoring. They tell you it's the main document. Here's the title. In this case, talking about clock synchronization. So they give you, if you're trying to meet this control, here are some things you need to set up. Have an external time source. You should, have it linked to use an NTP protocol. Make sure you have it, no more than 3, because otherwise your time can get out of whack. So it helps you design. If I want to make sure security monitoring and clock synchronization is in place, these are the 2 features I need to have set up. All right, and then finally, I've seen different ways people handle 2000 audits. And one is they'll just go through the framework as, interviews are always going to be part of it. I've seen some instances where people actually take a questionnaire. And in this case, we're looking at risk asset and treatment. And there's some questions where it's relevant. this is actually from a sample engagement which was done several years ago. And they'll say what's in place, the notes. It's very important to document it. If you're going to do an assessment like this, document all the interviews, all the follow-up documents, everything you receive, because it's ISO, gigantic aspect of it is documentation from soup to nuts. What you have in place, the audits, the evidence, that's required. Because the process is to first have someone come in, make sure you meet the 27001 standard, and then an auditing firm, which is there's only a subset of firms that can do this. They come in, verify you have everything in place, and then you can move forward on that. So if you have any questions, we'll come to the end, but I'm going to turn it over now to Danny.
Right. Thanks, Eric. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Danny Manimbo with Schellman. Happy to be presenting for you all today. So I think Sawyer and Eric did a great job of, setting the standard or setting the stage, I should say, for what these standards are and how they interrelate. And what I wanted to do in this last section was talk through the changes, both published and anticipated, to these standards in 2022, specifically for 27002 and 27001. And as many of you know, it's been an exciting year for the ISO 27000 series of standards, with 27002 2022 getting published in February of this year. But what hasn't happened yet is 27001 2022 getting published. So as Eric mentioned, that's the standard that you're getting certified against. So that's kind of what we're all waiting on in terms of how we're going to tackle the new version of the standard. So what I plan to talk through in this version, in this section, is how 27002 2022 compares to its predecessor in the 2013 version, and what's to come with 27001 2022, including kind of commonly asked questions around the anticipated publish or release date of the new version of 27001, as well as any transition periods. And a lot of this information is kind of as we know it today. So it is subject to change when speaking to the anticipated release date or transition periods. So I wanted to make sure that caveat was known, but as I mentioned, the objective of what we're doing today is just to share the latest and greatest information of what we have, so you all are prepared for what's to come. I normally do this presentation over about 45 minutes to an hour, so I'm going to do my best to keep these changes and the summary of them as high level as I can. And that said, Eric, if you don't mind, let's jump into the first slide of my section here. So at a high level, the biggest change introduced with the new 27002 version of the standard was the structure of the control set itself. The new standard is structured around 4 clauses, which categorizes the underlying controls into themes, and those themes are people controls, which is clause 6. This clause contains 8 total controls from domains like A7 of the 2013 version of the standard. You have physical controls, which is clause 7. This clause contains 14 controls from domains like A11 from the 2013 version of the standard. You have technological controls, which is clause 8. So this one contains a few more controls. It's 34 total from ITGC domains like A9, A12, A14 from the 2013 version of the standard. And everything else falls into what's called the organizational clause, which is clause 5. And this also contains a fair amount of controls. There's 37 total controls from various domains of the 2013 version of the standard, which you're familiar with, in A5, A6, A8, 15, 16, 17. So it's kind of a collection of anything that didn't fall into any of the other clauses. So the focus on the 4 clauses or themes is a pivot away from the traditional control objective format that was present in the 2013 version of the standard, which categorized the controls into those 14 control domains that we're all familiar with, that Eric just touched on in detail in A5 through A18.
Danny, I just want to make sure I'm on the right slide here. So
sure,
I'm on, because I don't know if you can see what I'm presenting.
Yeah, just FYI for the audience, we have one slide missing. So when we distribute these, we'll make sure the slide I'm kind of talking through in detail now is included. So Eric, you're good to hang on to that one though. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the whole idea with the change from the 2013 to this 2022 version was to make the controls more modernized, simplified, and versatile, where over 50 controls from the 2013 version of the standard were merged for simplification and ease of use and understanding. And it also removed, outdated references to things like obsolete technologies, which are inherent when you have a security standard that's about 9 years old now. So while the overall format of the controls has changed, the good news is that this is not, a tear down and rebuild of the Annex A controls where you're going to have to restructure your ISMS around a totally new and foreign, unfamiliar control set. And that's due to the overlap and the mapping with the existing version of the standard, which we will dive into today. So like I said, Eric, you're good to hang on to that slide for now. So kind of highlighted the changes is a few other big changes were there's a reduction of 21 controls. So we went from 114 total to 93, which I'm sure is great news and welcome from everybody. As I mentioned, kind of the concentration of the controls into those now 4 main buckets, the clauses or themes. 75% of those controls fall into organizational and technological. So those are by far, kind of the biggest of the 4 themes. We had 24 controls from the 2022 version, include a consolidation of 57 controls from the 2013 version. So that means you're going to have 2 or more controls combined from 2013, combined into a single control in the 2022 version. And then we have 58 controls from the 2013 version of the standard are 1-for-1 mapped to the 2022 version of the standard. So although there were updates to the wording and the general context behind the control, like I said, there's been modernization, things like references to more up-to-date technology and things like that, which can all be found in the 2022 version of the standard and the implementation guidance. So highly suggest, even though there is a 1-for-1 mapping, that you still take a look at the updated wording, implementation guidance, et cetera, to make sure your controls are still current and staying up with the times. And then every control, the last bullet here, every control from the 2013 version of the standard was mapped over to the 2022 version of the standard. And I'm sorry, I skipped one. There are 11 net new controls introduced, which we'll get into, in an upcoming slide here. So, folks have asked, what we think about the change. Is it a good one? Is it a bad one? I think it's a win for everybody. It's simplified. It has a lower control count. Both of those things keep this standard more manageable, allowing folks to basically kind of digest the new terminologies and kind of a control set structure. And I think with any standard, you don't want one that's overly complex and difficult to understand, especially one like 27001, which obviously is global in nature, and the idea is it's intended to be used by any type of organization. So, Eric, if you don't mind moving forward there, perfect. So to help organizations keep track of all those shifts and changes I was talking about on the last slide, the 2022 version of 27002 does have a 2-way mapping in Annex B of that standard, which shows the 2013 controls over to 2013 and vice versa to simplify this transition process. So thankfully, ISO's done a lot of that heavy lifting for us in terms of the 2-way mapping that I just mentioned, because part of the often the most painful part of these standards when they get updated is doing that mapping. So that's already there, and that should really facilitate the subsequent transition process for a lot of you all. And on this slide, we show an example of what Annex B looks like in terms of those 2-way mappings. With the table at the top, we show a preview of the mapping of 2022, which are those red controls, to 2013, which is that column in the middle. And the table at the bottom shows the mapping the other way around of 2013 on the left-hand side to the 2022 version of the standard, or which are those red controls in the middle with 5.1. And the red controls are in both tables are controls from the 2022 version of the standard. So from the first row at the table at the top, you can already see an example of some of the consolidation I was referring to, where we have 2 controls from the 2013 version of the standard are merged into a single control of the 2022 version of the standard in 5.1. So Eric, if you jump to the next slide, we'll talk through some of those 11 net new controls I mentioned. So Yeah, previously mentioned, so there's 11 net new controls, just meaning there's no mapping to the 2013 version of the standard. These are considered quote unquote new controls to the 2022 version of the standard. And for the sake of time, so we have a chance to get to Q&A, I won't do a deep dive on all 11 of these, but on the surface, I don't think any of these controls really represent totally foreign areas. And I think they're really representative of some of the modernization, that's taken place and was introduced with this 2022 version of the standard. And if you look at some of the control titles here, I mean, things like secure coding, configuration management certainly aren't new terms for any organizations out there with a mature security program. And certainly since 2020, with the pandemic, ICT, readiness for business continuity, has been a major focus for just about every company where, that traditional on-prem workforce has pivoted to a work from home or fully remote, workforce. So Eric, if you don't mind jumping to the next slide. All right, so we have another visual for you on this slide. We have two tables that are stacked vertically. The first table at the top shows the 27,002 2013 control set, which again organizes controls into those 14 domains in A5 through A18. We have the associated underlying control activity count shown in the parentheses after each domain. So I mentioned there was the 114 total controls there across those 4 domains. And then what you see on the bottom is now the 27,002 2022 version of the standard, which again simplifies the categorization of controls into the 4 main clauses or themes that we have shown on the bottom row there. Eric, if you don't mind jumping to the next one. One last visual here. I'm a visual learner, so this slide kind of really helped me see how all these changes in the mappings were absorbed in the 2022 version of the standard. So we mentioned that there's 24 controls in the 2022 version of the standard that include a consolidation of 57 controls from the 2013 version of the standard, meaning we have 2 or more controls getting merged into a single control. And sometimes even 3 or 4, as you can see kind of on the slide here. So that consolidation is shown on the top half of this slide. Hopefully it's not too hard to follow, but we have two columns, or 2 tables, I should say. So you have the 2022 controls kind of on the left-hand side. To the right of that, you have the 2013 controls, and you can see that there's at least 2, sometimes 3 or even 4 controls from 2013 that you see getting merged into a single control, and then we kind of duplicate that same structure on the right-hand side of the slide. And at the bottom half of the slide, we show basically what those 11 net new controls look like. So, Eric, if you advance ahead. So I hope that covered, answered some of your questions around the main changes to the 2022 version of the 27,002 standard, but certainly wanted to touch on where we stand with the 27,001 standard updates and what we anticipated will occur this year in terms of that standard getting published. Again, until all these standards or this standard, I should say, 27,001 is published by ISO, we won't know for certain what a lot of these changes are. But what we're communicating in terms of the presentation today is kind of just what we know, what we've been hearing, with kind of the most obvious change to 27,001 being that the new 27,002 control set that we've been talking about in the previous slides will replace what we know now as Annex A or A5 through A18. So that will be replaced with the 4 clauses or themes that we've talked about on the preceding slides. There will also be a minor change to the ISMS framework, clauses 4 through 10, right? That is specifically in clause 613. There's actually a reference to the term control objectives when it's introducing the concept of your SOA and how that's utilized to categorize the controls that have been selected to mitigate risks identified through your risk assessment process. So again, control objectives, we mentioned where there's a pivot away from that in the new version of the 27,002 controls, so that will be replaced. But other than that, from our understanding, there won't be any other major changes to clauses 4 through 10. So this is really looked at as really an update to the control set itself within Annex A of that 27,001 standard. And Eric, if you want to push through to my last slide, perfect. So, as is the norm with ISO and some of these updates, the release for 27001 keeps getting pushed out, at least what we've been communicated. It was originally thought that these changes would be published in May, which, as you know, it's June, and there is no 27001 standard published yet. And there was also confusion on whether this would represent an amendment to the 2013 version of 27001, or it would represent a totally new version in terms of the 2022 version of the standard. So what we know now is that this won't be an amendment. Technically, it might be too many details, but you can only amend a standard twice, and it's already been amended twice. So I'm not sure how there was some confusion around there possibly being an amendment to it, since it would have exceeded the maximum allowable number of amendments. So this will be a new version of 27001. So it will be 27001 2022. And now it appears that it will be released in Q4, even as early as 2023, although I don't think that would happen since it's the 2022 version of the standard. So for conservative purposes, I would plan on this getting released by the end of the year. And we've been hearing it's going to be released, as soon as potentially September 30th or October 1st. So I would certainly put that on your calendar. We won't know officially, of course, until it is published, but I would plan for that in terms of your transitions. Certainly if you don't have a copy of the 2022, sorry, a lot of twos today. You can go out, acquire that from ISO.org, and start looking at the controls, the implementation guidance, just so this isn't a shock or a surprise when it does get published. But one thing that is for certain is it seems like there will be at least a 2-year transition period, and that's from the date that 27001 2022 gets published. And that transmission period might be as long as potentially even 3 years from the date. Again, that's from the date it's published, for organizations to demonstrate that their ISMS conforms to the new version of 27001. And I know on the surface, 3 years sounds pretty long. 2 years, I think, is a reasonable amount. But so why 3 years? Why up to potentially as much as 3 years? It gives everybody time to transition. Number one, right? Certified clients, customers, but your certification body, so somebody like Schellman, it also gives us time to work with our accreditation bodies, because we'll actually need to be accredited to be able to perform certification audits against this new version of the standard. Sorry, I'm at a hotel. I got housekeeping coming in right now. I think we're good. Testing your ability to react on the fly here. But so that we're going to have to work with our accreditation bodies. At Schellman, we're accredited by ANAB and UCAS. We would have to work with our accreditation bodies to get accredited to certify clients against the new version of 27001 2022. So that gives us time to do that, because that would need to happen before, again, we can perform any certification audits. So again, whether it's 2 or 3 years, it builds in time for everybody to kind of take their time with this transition. Certainly, you can transition as soon as you'd like. We have some clients who are actually utilizing the new control set now, since ISO does allow you to use any type of control set. It doesn't have to be Annex A of 27001. The idea is just that those controls are considered, so nothing is overlooked. But a lot of some of our clients are actually using the 2022 version of 27002 now. The caveat is we just can't certify against 27001 2022 until, of course, that standard is updated and released. So I hope that information was helpful, was informative. I know we're going to leave about 10 minutes here for any Q&A that's come in.
Yes, thank you, Danny, Eric, and Sawyer for delivering this very informative webinar. Just to remind you that PCB offers training and certification courses, which will show your dedication in implementing and managing information security and privacy-related frameworks. And most importantly, you will get recognized worldwide. Now, without further ado, we will go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees. And the first question is, what is the relation between ISO 27005 and ISO 27032?
Yeah, sure, I can talk about that. So 27032 addresses the term cyberspace really generally. It talks a lot about basically the internet, right? 27005 is a much more applicable use of information security risk assessment techniques. It talks through a lot of guidance on how to actually conduct a risk assessment. So think of 32 as more of the almost like a philosophical standard that describes the cyberspace and why risk management considerations are important. 27005 is sort of a playbook, if you will, a way of executing risk assessments.
Thank you, Sawyer. Okay, I'll go on with the next question. What is for you the best tool to create an ISMS from zero?
There's multiple factors that put into it. I think the best thing just to be organized, in terms of whether using a spreadsheet initially, there's a lot of online tools. Just list out where you stand. I mean, I think the first part of any assessment is, I gave a sample before of a spreadsheet, which lists out all the controls, all the areas, and you want to see, regardless of the framework, where you stand, what do you have in place, go over each aspect, and then based on the description, is it in place, is it partial, is it not in place, or is it not applicable? Because sometimes there may be a control, like if it's development related, and your organization doesn't do any kind of application development, that'll be NA. But I think I would start at the most base level with a spreadsheet just to get you going. But to earlier points, I agree, using some kind of a tool. There's tons of SaaS applications now where you can track it, especially if you want to be ISO certified. You want to have it in one place and make sure that you can constantly see your progress and measure, as well as put the KPIs in there to see how you're coming along.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I mean, we're all in consulting here. Working with firms who have done this is a good place to start. One of the first steps I would take, though, is downloading the standard 27001 and giving that a good read. I'm always surprised at how many people I talk to who are looking to pursue certification that have not purchased the standard yet. It's pretty cheap, right? A couple $100, and it's worth the read for sure if you're looking to do this. Shameless plug, though, Risk 360 has something pretty big coming out on Monday that might help you out with this. So.
Yeah, that's great. And the only other thing I'd add, certainly from a resources perspective, the technology tools and working with a consultant, if you don't have the expertise or resources in-house, prior to reaching out to a certification body like Schellman, just to make sure that when you do start, it's not, kind of an overwhelming and you're getting more nonconformities than you otherwise, would have potentially avoided if you'd, spent a lot of time on the front end. Probably for most of the audits that we do, ISO might be one of the ones that requires the most upfront work. There's a lot of documentation, policies, procedures, scope statements, building out risk assessment. So it does take a considerable amount of time and effort.
And to both their points, they're correct, because I think one of the struggles can be, what constitutes that you're meeting that control? What's acceptable? What's not? How do we have to tweak it? So having some kind of guidance, someone who's been through that, can really help you, expedite the entire process.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, the other question is it necessary for you to have both cybersecurity policy and information security policy once your organization completes the assessment of the 2022 version?
I think on that question, what you call policies can vary greatly between organizations, right? It's sort of a matter of opinion sometimes on what you title a policy. I think the important part is to address in some type of policy, whether it's a single policy or multiple standalone policies, address the topics that need to be covered. When you think about a policy, think about that really as management's intent for the security program, right? That's management defining the approach that they want the organization to take. And then those who are recipients or consumers of that policy need to apply that approach. And usually those are the folks who are coming up with more specific procedures that apply that policy. So I wouldn't get hung up on the title of the policy or what it's called. I would focus more on what the concepts and topics in the standard are and make sure that you have policy to address each of those.
Yeah, and what I tend to see is that it tends to be more granular. They'll have like specific policy, acceptable use, encryption, and then you'll have an overall one, which will cover multiple, aspects which probably don't warrant their own separate one. But I do think, the most important thing in any policy is make sure it's realistic. I've seen policies which are unbelievable, and then the realities they're not put in operations, and that's the worst thing you want, because policies are essentially stating, here's our guidance, here's what we adhere to, and you want to make sure that you actually have that in practice, because that'll throw you off. I mean, one of the things for certification, if you look at the management clauses, if they're not in place, doesn't matter what you're doing operationally, you're going to fail the standard. So you want to make sure your policies map, reality. And if it doesn't, put some kind of lateral language in there, on a best efforts basis, things of that nature.
Yep. And the one thing I'll add on that is kind of the one thing that, what we're doing as certification bodies when we perform these certification audits is we not only audit to the standard, but to Eric's point, we also audit to your internal policies as well in terms of how you're meeting those. So certainly not making them overly stringent and unrealistic to Eric's point is, a good thing to consider.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. This is directed to Eric. Eric, can you elaborate on the number of ISMS controls? What do you count as control, for instance?
A control would be a specific thing you need to adhere to. So just kind of like the control points I put in that early release, those are all very specific things that you need. So an example would be, do you have logging in place? Okay, yes, you do. Are you retaining it for 1 year? No, we're doing it for 6 months, so it's partial. So it's going to be all the detailed specifics of that control, the aspects. I gave the example of the time server. Like, what do you have a time server in place using NTP? Yes. Are you using 3 sources? No, only using 1. So it's going to be all the little details of that control. So it's essentially a breakout of the program and what you're doing in each area.
Okay, thank you very much.
So.
Okay, thank you, Danny, Eric, and Sawyer for presenting today, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Just be informed that this session is recorded and will also be published on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all, and obviously feel free to connect on LinkedIn or things. We appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks, everybody.
Same here.
Thank you.
See ya.